They refused to serve a black passenger until he called his lawyer and shut the airline down. Have you ever witnessed an act so blatantly unjust that it made your blood boil? Well, buckle up, because what you're about to hear will leave you shaking with anger and cheering for a triumph you never expected. This isn't just another story of poor customer service. This is a full-blown battle against racism at 30,000 feet. When a routine flight turned into an all-out war of dignity for a black passenger, no one could predict the fallout that would bring an entire airline to its knees. Intrigued? Trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. Let's get into it. Darius Johnson had always believed in doing things the right way. He was the type of man who never cut corners, never tried to game the system, and always paid his dues, often quite literally, with his meticulously earned money. So when he finally decided to indulge in a first-class ticket on Cloud9 Airlines for a cross-country flight from Atlanta to Seattle, it felt less like an extravagance and more like a reward he had rightfully earned. The whole idea for this trip stemmed from an important conference that Darius needed to attend. He worked for a major tech company, a place where talent and hard work were said to be the currency that mattered most. Despite the outward claims of progressive values, Darius had faced subtle discrimination throughout his life. The snide comments, the assumptions, the condescension. He was no stranger to all that, but he never let it break his spirit. Instead, he held his head up high and made sure his excellence spoke louder than his skin color. So, with his newly minted bonus, he booked the Cloud9 Airlines seat in first class, a seat he believed symbolized the upward trajectory of his hard-fought career. In the days leading up to the flight, Darius took comfort in planning every detail, from transportation to the airport to the brand-new laptop bag he purchased specifically for the trip. As he read up on the in-flight amenities, he felt a quiet excitement. A lie flatbed, gourmet meals, and dedicated service were all part of the first-class experience. It wasn't that he expected to be treated like royalty. He merely hoped to receive the respect and comfort that was promised and that he had paid for. However, Darius had no idea that his dream of a smooth journey would soon unravel in the most heartbreaking way possible. He had no idea that his presence in that exclusive cabin would spark a chain of events so harrowing that newspapers like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution would later cover the story on their front page. Nor did he suspect that this single flight would become a defining chapter in his life, a chapter that would pit him against a powerful corporation and ultimately reshape his destiny. If you asked Darius that week how he felt about Cloud9 Airlines, he would have admitted he'd barely heard of them before booking. They were just another airline, offering a convenient schedule and a pretty decent price for a first-class seat. Little did he know, soon he'd hold in his hands the power to bring this very airline to its knees. The day of departure arrived bright and early. Darius, always punctual, arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with plenty of time to spare. Pulling his sleek new laptop bag behind him, he navigated the bustling terminals with practiced ease. After all, this wasn't his first rodeo. He had flown multiple times for work, but there was something about flying first class that put a purposeful spring in his step. For once, he was going to enjoy a bit of extra legroom and, hopefully, stellar service. At the Cloud9 Airlines check-in counter, everything seemed normal at first. Darius handed over his ID and ticket confirmation to a polite but somewhat distant agent. She tapped on her keyboard, avoided making eye contact, and finally printed out his boarding pass. Then it happened. A flicker in her eyes, a subtle shift in her tone. "Here you go," she said, forcing a tight smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir." He could practically feel the tension. It was the same unspoken vibe he'd encountered countless times, someone noticing his skin color and making assumptions. Was he being paranoid? Possibly. Darius told himself not to jump to conclusions. This was a major airline, and most employees were trained in customer service. Whatever awkwardness lingered, he brushed it aside for the moment. Security went off without a hitch, and soon he found himself at the exclusive first-class lounge. A uniformed attendant scanned his boarding pass. She looked it over once, then looked at Darius, then looked at the pass again. An uncomfortable moment ticked by before she cleared her throat and forced another overly bright smile. "Welcome to the Cloud9 Lounge," she said. "Feel free to take a seat anywhere you like." Darius stepped inside, put his bag down, and tried to relax. He chalked up these interactions to typical airport stress. When boarding was announced, he got in line with the other first-class passengers, mostly business types in suits, a few retirees who looked like they traveled a lot, and one or two families who'd upgraded to more comfortable seats. He handed his pass to the gate agent, who barely looked at him. This time, no awkward glances or stutters. Darius figured everything was fine. It would be just another flight, maybe a bit more luxurious. Little did he know, this was only the quiet before the storm. The tension that simmered in those small glances was about to erupt in the sky, where escape was impossible and conflict was inevitable. Darius found his seat in the first-class cabin, marveling at the plush cushion and ample legroom. Clouds of soft lighting bathed the cabin in a soothing glow. It was a significant upgrade from the cramped economy seats he'd endured before. For a moment, he felt a rush of gratitude. He was living proof that hard work could pay off, that a life of diligence and resilience could bring him a piece of comfort, however small, however fleeting. A blonde flight attendant with a practiced smile strode down the aisle, greeting passengers individually. The moment she reached Darius, her face stiffened, almost imperceptibly, but enough for him to notice. She glanced at his boarding pass, as if verifying that he belonged there. "Good morning, sir," she said. "May I get you something to drink before we take off?" Her professional tone couldn't completely mask the slight edge in her voice. Despite his better judgment, Darius decided to let it slide. "Thank you. Orange juice would be great," he replied with a small smile, trying to break the ice. She nodded curtly and disappeared behind the curtain to fetch his beverage. When she returned, she placed the glass on his tray table without a word. Then she moved on, showering other passengers with a warmth noticeably absent in her interactions with Darius. The difference was so stark, it felt like a gust of cold air had just swept over his seat. The flight attendant took a moment to chat with a middle-aged man in a suit, a few seats ahead of him, laughing at something he said about the weather in Seattle. Then she lingered by an older couple, inquiring if they needed help stowing their bags. But with Darius, it was as if her entire demeanor shifted to minimal civility. He wasn't imagining this. His heart sank a little. Still, he took a deep breath and reminded himself he was used to subtle racism. It happened in stores, restaurants, on the streets. Why should it be different here? He told himself not to let it ruin his journey. If this is the worst that happened, he would consider himself lucky. But the flight had only just begun to taxi. Darius had no idea that being shunned for conversation was only the first of many indignities. Soon, these small signs of discrimination would escalate into something far more damaging, something that would threaten to strip away his humanity and spark the biggest fight of his life. About an hour into the flight, the seat belt signs switched off and a new wave of activity rippled through the cabin. The flight attendants began their in-flight service, rolling out carts laden with meals and drinks. From his seat, Darius watched the blonde flight attendant and her colleagues serve the other first-class passengers. There was small talk, laughter, questions about dietary preferences. Everything seemed to exude warmth and courtesy until they reached Darius. He was reading over the conference materials on his laptop when he noticed them skip him entirely in the initial round of meal orders. The attendant in question, her name tag, read Jacqueline, didn't even meet his gaze. She just pushed the cart past him and served a row behind. Confusion flared in Darius's eyes. He cleared his throat politely, hoping to catch her attention without making a scene. But she seemed determined not to look his way. Eventually, Darius lightly pressed the call button. Another flight attendant, a younger, dark-haired man named Carl, came over. Darius explained he hadn't been given a chance to order his meal. Carl apologized sincerely and took his selection. But as soon as Carl left, Jacqueline marched over, her lips pursed in barely concealed annoyance. "You need something?" she asked curtly, emphasizing each word as though speaking to a child. Darius was taken aback. I already ordered with Carl. He said he'd bring it out soon." She frowned, looking almost offended. "This is my section. Next time, you can wait until I come around, sir." There was a biting condescension in her tone, and Darius felt it slice through him. He'd done everything by the book, waiting quietly for service like everyone else. Why was she so irritated with him? Why was she speaking to him as though he were a nuisance? Before he could respond, Jacqueline turned on her heel and stalked off. Darius sat there, his chest tight with anger and hurt. He wanted to speak up, but a voice inside warned him to stay calm. He was on a plane, thousands of feet in the air. Causing a scene would only make matters worse. Plus, he had a conference to attend, a job to protect. The last thing he needed was a confrontation that could spiral out of control. But in that moment, he had no idea that fate was already conspiring against him. The seeds of conflict had been planted, and they would soon grow into a confrontation far beyond anything he could manage with quiet compliance. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Darius began to suspect that this flight would be far from ordinary and that there was a storm brewing just out of sight. As the flight leveled out in cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, giving passengers a chance to relax or catch some sleep. Darius attempted to focus on his conference materials, but Jacqueline's frosty demeanor kept nagging at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Every time she walked by, he felt her disapproval radiating in his direction, even though she scarcely glanced at him. He told himself to ignore it, but the tension became more tangible with each passing minute. At one point, Darius noticed another passenger, a white man in an aisle seat, trying to get Jacqueline's attention. She rushed to him, all accommodating smiles. The man had a question about the in-flight Wi-Fi, and Jacqueline patiently explained how to log in and troubleshoot. Afterward, Darius attempted to ask her the same thing. He was having some trouble accessing the internet for his conference materials, but she brushed him off with a dismissive wave of her hand and snapped, "It's in the instructions. Please read them." It felt like a slap in the face. Each microaggression chipped away at his composure, leaving him hot with frustration. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt so blatantly excluded, maybe in high school, when a teacher assumed he couldn't afford a certain school trip, or in a boutique store where a sales associate had followed him around, convinced he was there to steal. But this felt different. Maybe it was because he was stuck with her in a confined space. Maybe it was because he'd paid a premium for this seat, only to be treated like a trespasser in an exclusive club. Whatever the reason, Darius reached a breaking point. He caught Carl's eye as he passed by and asked politely if they could speak somewhere private. Carl led him to the galley at the front of the plane, away from the curious stares of other passengers. "I'm really sorry about all this," Carl began, looking genuinely concerned. "I've noticed Jacqueline's been a bit curt." "I'll speak to her." Darius swallowed the frustration lumped in his throat. "I appreciate that, but I'd like to know why she's ignoring me or speaking rudely. It's constant. I don't want to escalate things, but this is getting out of hand." Carl nodded. "I'll have a word with her, sir. If there's anything else I can do for you, please let me know. I want you to enjoy your flight." Darius thanked him and returned to his seat, hoping that would be the end of it. He had no interest in drama. He just wanted to get to Seattle, attend his conference, and maybe catch a few hours of rest in the process. But the wheels of fate were already turning, and the next phase of this airborne nightmare was about to begin. 20 minutes later, Darius was scrolling through an offline document when Jacqueline appeared by his side, brandishing a tray with his meal. She placed the tray down with a noticeable thud, causing the silverware to rattle. "You spoke to Carl about me?" she asked, her voice dripping with hostility. Darius looked up, startled. The cabin was fairly quiet. A few heads turned at her sharp tone. He forced a calm expression. "I only mentioned that I was having issues getting service, that's all," Jacqueline huffed, folding her arms across her neatly pressed uniform. "You need to understand something. I have a job to do. I can't cater to every little whim, especially when I'm the lead flight attendant for a full cabin." Darius felt his pulse quicken. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking for the same service everyone else here is getting." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't like your attitude. I've been working this route for 5 years, and I've never had a complaint until now." He took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but from where I sit, it feels like you've singled me out." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she dropped her voice to a near whisper, as though sharing a secret she wanted no one else to hear. "People like you come in expecting red carpet treatment, thinking you can throw money around and act like you own the place. Well, guess what? You don't." Darius's heart thundered in his chest. "Excuse me, you heard me. Now, you can either sit down, eat your meal quietly, and stop making a fuss, or I'll call security when we land. Understood?" It was a threat, plain and simple. Darius stared at her, stunned, every muscle in his body tensed. He noticed out of the corner of his eye that Carl was watching from the galley, worry etched on his face. Other passengers had gone silent, their gazes flicking toward him and Jacqueline. In that moment, all the years of microaggressions, of being followed in stores, of having to prove his worth again and again, came crashing down on him. He knew if he let her bully him, it would never end. But he also knew a single misstep could have dire consequences, especially at 35,000 feet. So he did the only thing he could. He calmly told her she was out of line, and then turned to face forward, refusing to engage further in her intimidation tactics. Little did he know, his small stand for self-respect would be the spark that lit the fuse for the explosive events to follow. The mood in the first-class cabin shifted dramatically after that confrontation. Passengers who had been busy with their in-flight entertainment or napping were now wide awake, sensing the thick tension in the air. Jacqueline kept shooting daggers from her eyes at Darius as she continued her rounds, while Carl tried to smooth things over, offering Darius a refill on his drink and an extra dessert to compensate for the unpleasantness. Darius, for his part, was torn between anger and worry. He knew that if he got too vocal or confrontational, it could be twisted against him. He might be labeled disruptive, a dangerous word for any passenger, but especially for a black man in a high-stress environment. He watched the clock, counting the hours until they touched down in Seattle. But the turbulence wasn't just emotional. About halfway through the flight, the aircraft hit a rough patch of air, causing the cabin to lurch. Jacqueline had been making another pass through the aisle, and the jolt caused her to stumble. She fell sideways, nearly landing on Darius's armrest. Instead of righting herself and moving on, she caught Darius's eye with a look of unfiltered rage. "You tripped me," she spat, raising her voice. Darius's eyes widened. "No, I didn't." The plane shook. Jacqueline turned toward another flight attendant, as if to gather witnesses. "Did you see that? He stuck out his arm." No one had seen anything of the sort. The flight attendant in question just looked at Jacqueline, perplexed. Passengers around them shook their heads, murmuring that it was just turbulence. But Jacqueline persisted, accusing Darius of trying to cause her harm. This was the moment that truly flipped the switch. Jacqueline's baseless accusation transformed the situation from a matter of poor service into something more serious, potentially a security issue. Darius's heart pounded in his chest, not just from the adrenaline of the turbulence, but from the realization that she was escalating the conflict to a dangerous level. If the captain heard one side of the story, that a passenger had allegedly assaulted a flight attendant, Darius could face immediate consequences, maybe even legal trouble. Carl intervened, pulling Jacqueline away before the situation could worsen. Darius sank back in his seat, a swirl of fury and apprehension clouding his mind. He tried to collect his thoughts, uncertain of how to protect himself from this unfolding nightmare. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come. The moment the plane landed, the fight for his dignity and later for justice would truly begin. When the flight finally touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Darius exhaled a shaky sigh of relief. He had spent the last hour of the flight in tense anticipation, wondering if Jacqueline would convince the captain to have him escorted off by the authorities. Each time a flight attendant passed, his heart jumped, worried they might be delivering news of a police presence waiting at the gate. The seatbelt sign flicked off, and passengers began to gather their belongings from overhead bins. Darius was about to stand when Carl approached him with an apologetic face. "Mr. Johnson, I just wanted you to know I spoke to the captain. Jacqueline made some claims, but several passengers vouched for you. They saw everything. You shouldn't have any problems deplaning." Relief washed over Darius, but it was tinged with lingering dread. "Thank you, Carl. I appreciate you sticking up for me." Carl nodded. "I'm so sorry about all this. If you need anything, just let me know. We'll be filing a report about this incident." Darius felt a surge of gratitude toward Carl, but also a sadness that the incident had marred what should have been an exciting trip. As he grabbed his laptop bag and stepped into the aisle, Jacqueline stood at the front of the first-class cabin, glaring at him. Darius walked past her without meeting her eyes. He could practically feel the heat of her hostility following him down the jet bridge. He made it into the terminal and started toward baggage claim, relieved to be free from the oppressive atmosphere of that aircraft cabin. Yet, just as he was about to step onto the escalator, he noticed two uniformed airport security officers walking purposefully in his direction. His heart lurched. Was she really trying to escalate this even further? "Excuse me, are you Darius Johnson?" one of the officers asked. Darius nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "We've received a complaint from an airline employee about a possible assault on board," the other officer said, eyes scanning Darius for any sign of aggression. A hot flare of anger ignited in Darius's chest. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. He remembered Carl's words that multiple passengers had vouched for him. He also remembered that he had done nothing wrong. If Jacqueline thought she could pin a false charge on him, she was about to face the truth. He calmly explained his side of the story. The officers seemed skeptical at first, but as they listened and noted the multiple accounts from passengers who were deplaning behind him, their demeanor shifted. Eventually, they apologized for the inconvenience and let him go without further questioning. But the damage was done. Darius stood there in the terminal, his suitcase at his side, feeling battered and humiliated. What had begun as a routine business trip had turned into a harrowing ordeal. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight, one that would not end until he sought legal counsel and brought an entire airline corporation to its knees. Once Darius safely checked into his hotel and put down his bags, he collapsed onto the bed and stared at the ceiling. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still surging through his veins, and his mind buzzed with unanswered questions and simmering rage. He had a conference to focus on, presentations to give, yet all he could think about was that humiliating flight. He sat up, grabbed his phone, and began typing out a detailed account of the incident. He didn't want to rely on memory alone. Every comment, every glare, every hateful insinuation, he documented them as best he could, with timestamps referencing the flight schedule. He even noted the names on the flight attendant name tags, especially Carl and Jacqueline. Once he finished, he browsed social media, searching for any mention of Cloud9 Airlines and racial discrimination. He found some scattered complaints, but nothing that seemed as blatant as his encounter. That gave him pause. Perhaps his case was more unusual than he'd thought, or maybe other people just hadn't come forward with their stories. Later that evening, he attended the first session of the tech conference, trying his best to remain composed. When colleagues asked him how his flight was, Darius forced a polite smile and said, "Fine, not wanting to air his ordeal in public just yet," but inside he fumed with righteous indignation. He was tired of always having to bite his tongue, to be the bigger person in situations of blatant injustice. After the session, Darius retreated to his hotel room. He reread his written account of the incident, anger sparking anew with each word. That's when it hit him. He should consult a lawyer. This wasn't just a minor customer service mishap. This was targeted discrimination, racial profiling, and overt harassment by an airline employee. He realized that if he let this slide, it would not only eat at his own sense of justice, but it would also signal that such behavior was tolerable. Reaching for his phone again, Darius searched for a civil rights attorney in Seattle. One name appeared over and over in the reviews: Thomas Green, known for taking on big corporations and winning. Darius quickly scribbled down the number, determined to make that call the moment he had a break in his conference schedule. A sense of resolve washed over him. He might have been hurt, but he was far from defeated. In fact, he was just getting started. 2 days later, with his keynote presentation behind him, Darius finally found the time and emotional fortitude to call Thomas Green's office. A polite, professional assistant answered, asked a few preliminary questions, and scheduled an appointment for Darius to come in person. The firm was located in downtown Seattle, only a short ride away from his hotel. When Darius walked into the law firm's office, he was struck by the calm authority emanating from the minimalist decor and the quiet hum of purposeful activity. A receptionist ushered him into a glass-walled conference room, where Thomas Green soon joined him. Green was in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and an intense, analytical gaze. He greeted Darius warmly, offered him a seat, and got straight to business. "So, Mr. Johnson," Green began, interlocking his fingers on the table, "I'd like you to tell me everything that happened on this flight, from the moment you arrived at the airport to when you walked away from those security officers." Darius took a deep breath and recounted the story in painstaking detail. As he spoke, Green jotted down notes, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. After Darius finished, Green leaned back in his chair, wearing a thoughtful expression. "It's not every day that we get a case like this," Green said. "But from what you've described, this appears to be a clear case of racial discrimination, blatant enough that we might be looking at a violation of federal and possibly state anti-discrimination laws." Darius felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "So, there's a case here?" Green nodded. "Absolutely. The flight attendant's behavior, combined with the false accusation of assault, not to mention any attempt the airline might have made to back her up, suggests a pattern that could warrant legal action. But we need more evidence, witness statements, official reports from the airline, and if possible, any electronic records like security footage or communication between the cabin crew and the cockpit." Darius leaned forward. "I have a few passengers' contact info. They approached me after the flight to express their support. and Carl, one of the flight attendants, seemed sympathetic. "That's excellent," Green said. "I recommend we gather as many witness accounts as possible. The more we can demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory treatment, the stronger our case becomes. Are you prepared for what might be a lengthy, drawn-out battle?" Darius paused for a moment, thinking about the emotional toll, the financial risk, and the potential backlash. But then he remembered Jacqueline's cold sneer, her hateful words, and the false accusation that could have upended his life entirely. "Yes," he said, his voice resolute, "I am." Over the next week, Darius and Thomas Green worked tirelessly to build their case. Green filed the initial complaint against Cloud9 Airlines, alleging racial discrimination and defamation. Darius reached out to his handful of passenger contacts, emailing them to ask if they'd be willing to submit written statements or speak to Green directly. To his relief, several agreed without hesitation, appalled by what they had witnessed on the flight. Carl, the helpful flight attendant, proved to be the most valuable contact. He risked his job by sharing his own account, confirming that he saw Jacqueline single out Darius for harsher treatment. He even hinted at a toxic culture within Cloud9 Airlines, one that often looked the other way when senior flight attendants showed bias. According to Carl, there had been whisperings of prior complaints, but they'd been quietly swept under the rug. As the days turned into weeks, the lawsuit began to draw media attention, particularly after the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a headline that read, "Airline in hot water over alleged racial discrimination." Darius found himself fielding phone calls and emails from reporters, advocacy groups, and even other victims who claimed to have faced similar discrimination on flights. The airline's initial response was one of denial and minimization. They released a terse statement claiming they took such accusations very seriously and would conduct an internal investigation. Privately, their legal team fired off letters to Green, trying to settle the matter quietly with a small sum of money and a confidentiality clause. Green politely declined, stating that his client sought more than monetary compensation. He wanted accountability and systemic change. Cloud9 Airlines dug in its heels. They insisted Jacqueline was a model employee, that any allegations of racism were fabricated. They also implied Darius had been aggressive, and they suggested that his own behavior had contributed to the incident. That's when Green pulled out the ace up his sleeve, the passenger statements and Carl's corroboration of events. With the mounting evidence in Darius's favor, negotiations stalled. A trial date loomed, and Cloud9 Airlines realized they were facing a public relations nightmare. If this went to trial, the media coverage could be disastrous. Yet for reasons that later became painfully clear, the airline's executives chose to fight rather than address the deeper issues. They believed their brand was untouchable, that they could wear down this single passenger who dared to stand up for his rights. They had no idea just how wrong they were. As the lawsuit gained momentum, social media lit up with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #Cloud9Scandal. Activists, influencers, and everyday passengers shared their own stories of discrimination in the skies, many directed at Cloud9 Airlines. While not all stories were as severe as Darius's, the sheer volume suggested a troubling pattern that the public could no longer ignore. News outlets across the country began picking up the story, and soon Darius's face appeared on television interviews. The more he spoke about his experience, the more people rallied around him. He was not just fighting for himself, he was standing up for the countless individuals who had faced similar mistreatment, but lacked the platform or resources to fight back. Meanwhile, Cloud9 Airlines scrambled to manage the crisis. Their PR team released carefully worded statements about their long-standing commitment to diversity and inclusion, but these rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence. Stock prices for the airline took a hit as investors grew nervous about the looming lawsuit and the negative publicity. Throughout this maelstrom, Darius tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He continued his work at the tech company, focusing on his projects and deadlines. Yet, he couldn't escape the constant calls from reporters, the social media mentions, the supportive emails from strangers who wished him luck. His life had become a public battleground for racial justice, something he never sought, but was now committed to seeing through. Thomas Green worked around the clock, preparing for the possibility of a trial. He also leveraged the media attention, giving press statements that highlighted the broader systemic issues. "This isn't about one bad flight attendant," he said repeatedly. "This is about a corporate culture that permits or even fosters discriminatory treatment. It must end." As tensions reached a fever pitch, rumors circulated that Jacqueline had been placed on administrative leave, though Cloud9's management refused to confirm or deny it. Some speculated she might be the scapegoat, that the airline would sacrifice her to save its own reputation. But Darius and Green knew that firing one employee wouldn't fix the deeper problem. They pressed forward, determined to hold the entire airline accountable. In the midst of all this, Darius never lost sight of why he fought. It was for that young black kid who might save up for a first-class seat one day, only to be told he didn't belong. It was for every moment he had been judged by his skin color rather than his character. For the first time, Darius felt like he had the power to make a difference, and he would not let go of that responsibility easily. As the discovery phase of the lawsuit began, Thomas Green's legal team demanded all relevant documents and communications from Cloud9 Airlines. Much of it was standard procedure: flight logs, crew assignments, training manuals, and any past complaints similar to Darius's. The airline's lawyers pushed back, accusing Green of conducting a fishing expedition. But the judge granted the request, given the serious allegations. What emerged from the stacks of documents was startling. Internal emails revealed that Jacqueline had been the subject of at least 3 prior complaints involving racial bias. In each case, the airline quietly offered the complainants a voucher or a small settlement, extracting a non-disclosure agreement to silence them. There was even an email chain in which a manager wrote, "We need to keep this quiet." Negative press could be damaging. Darius felt a wave of vindication tempered by outrage when Green showed him these documents. The airline had known about Jacqueline's behavior and done nothing to correct it. Instead, they chose to shield her and themselves behind hushed payoffs and legal maneuvers. It was a damning revelation that painted a picture of willful neglect. Moreover, Carl's testimony became even more critical. He confirmed that he had personally witnessed at least one of these prior incidents with Jacqueline, though he'd been too new at the time to fully understand the implications. His account matched the airline's internal emails, making it clear that Cloud9 Airlines had failed in their duty to protect passengers from discriminatory treatment. Armed with these discoveries, Green moved for a summary judgment, arguing that the airline's liability was clear. But the airline's attorneys stubbornly refused to concede. They wanted to fight in open court, perhaps clinging to the hope that a jury might be sympathetic to their defense or that some procedural technicality could save them. In the court of public opinion, though, the airline was already losing, and losing badly. As more details emerged, social media exploded. Hashtags like #CloudedJudgment and #9strikesyou'reout trended nationwide. Influential figures began calling for a boycott of Cloud9 Airlines, urging people to find alternative carriers until the company addressed the allegations head-on. Darius watched the unfolding drama with a mix of anxiety and resolve. He had never envisioned himself as a civil rights crusader, but there he was, at the center of a storm that he couldn't have predicted. Part of him wanted to go back to a life of anonymity, but another part recognized the profound significance of this moment. If he succeeded, it wouldn't just be a personal victory, it could be a stepping stone for broader change in the airline industry and beyond. The day the trial finally began, a throng of reporters clustered outside the courthouse. Darius and Thomas Green made their way through the crowd, ignoring the barrage of questions and camera flashes. Inside, the tension was palpable. Cloud9 Airlines had brought a high-powered legal team, while Green was flanked by associates armed with dossiers of evidence. Spectators filled the courtroom. Some were activists, some were law students, and others were simply curious onlookers drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. During opening statements, Green laid out a meticulously crafted narrative. He emphasized that this case was about systemic racial discrimination, about an airline that knowingly harbored a flight attendant with a history of biased behavior, and about a courageous passenger who stood up and said enough. The airline's lawyer countered that the events were blown out of proportion, that the prior complaints were unrelated and resolved amicably, and that Darius himself had been confrontational. Then came the witness testimonies. One by one, passengers from Darius's flight took the stand, recounting how they observed Jacqueline's hostility and how she blatantly ignored or belittled Darius. Their testimonies were consistent, painting a damning portrait of her discriminatory actions. Carl's testimony was the highlight. He recounted everything in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, directly contradicting Jacqueline's version of events. Jacqueline's turn on the stand came with a flurry of tension. She looked nervous, her eyes flickering between her own attorney and the jury. She stuck to a rehearsed story that Darius was demanding, that he tried to trip her, that he instigated the conflict by constantly pressing the call button. But Green meticulously picked apart her account, using flight logs, passenger statements, and her own contradictory words from previous depositions. The most devastating blow came when Green introduced the internal emails into evidence. The courtroom fell silent as Green read them aloud, each line a scathing indictment of the airline's deliberate cover-ups. By the time he finished, Jacqueline's face had turned ashen, and the airline's legal team looked visibly rattled. For the first time, it seemed inevitable that Cloud9 Airlines would have to face full accountability for not just Jacqueline's actions, but also their broader institutional failures. As the trial went on, public support for Darius soared. Grassroots campaigns sprouted online, encouraging travelers to avoid Cloud9 Airlines. Some major corporate travel agencies even dropped the airline from their recommended lists. Through it all, Darius stayed focused, drawing strength from the knowledge that his fight was bigger than himself. And with every piece of evidence that Green skillfully introduced, the cracks in Cloud9's defense widened, inching them closer to the brink of a historic downfall. After a tense deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with the verdict. The atmosphere was electric. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked and flashed, and spectators leaned forward in their seats. Darius's heart pounded so fiercely he thought it would leap out of his chest. The jury found Cloud9 Airlines liable for racial discrimination and defamation. In a scathing rebuke, they condemned the airline's ongoing and willful negligence in addressing prior complaints against Jacqueline. The court awarded Darius both compensatory and punitive damages, an amount so substantial it made headlines the following morning. More importantly, the judge mandated that Cloud9 Airlines implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees and establish a transparent reporting system for complaints. A collective gasp of relief and triumph rippled through the courtroom. As Darius embraced Thomas Green, a swirl of emotions coursed through him: vindication, gratitude, and an overpowering sense of validation for all the times he'd been made to feel less than. Outside, cameras converged on him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't shy away from them. He looked into the flashing lights and said, "This is a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin." In the days that followed, Cloud9 Airlines faced a public relations meltdown of epic proportions. Stockholders demanded the resignation of key executives who had overseen the cover-ups. The airline's CEO stepped down, citing personal reasons, though speculation about the lawsuit's impact was rampant. Jacqueline was officially terminated, but by then, the company's reputation was irreparably tarnished. Rumors soon began swirling that Cloud9 Airlines might have to downsize drastically to survive or even file for bankruptcy. One by one, major travel partners severed ties. Flight bookings plummeted. Employees worried about losing their jobs. Even the airline's historical loyalty base began to seek out alternatives, unwilling to support a company associated with blatant discrimination. Darius took no joy in the potential job losses for innocent employees, but he couldn't help acknowledging that this was a form of karmic retribution for a company that had ignored repeated warnings about its toxic culture. He had never set out to ruin an airline. He had only wanted justice. Yet, the chain of events he had set in motion would become a watershed moment in the airline industry, a cautionary tale about the cost of turning a blind eye to discrimination. In the weeks that followed, Cloud9 Airlines announced plans for a complete restructuring, hoping to salvage what remained of their operation. They rebranded flight routes and tried to spin a new marketing campaign about renewed commitment to equality and customer service. But it was too late. The public's trust had been shattered, and the name Cloud9 was associated with scandal, corruption, and racism. Eventually, the airline quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Many speculated that even after reorganization, the brand would never recover. Some employees found work at other airlines, but an unsettling number faced uncertain futures. While Darius was empathetic toward those who had lost their livelihoods, he also recognized a painful truth. If Cloud9 had acted on the previous complaints against Jacqueline, or at least responded promptly and fairly when he voiced his concerns, none of this would have reached such a catastrophic end. For Darius, life changed dramatically as well. The lawsuit settlement gave him financial security, allowing him to pay off debts and provide for his family. He donated a significant portion to organizations fighting for civil rights, determined to turn his personal ordeal into broader social progress. He also became an unofficial spokesperson, giving talks on racial justice and corporate accountability. Companies invited him to speak at workshops, and he brought Thomas Green along to outline the legal repercussions businesses face when they let prejudice fester. There were times when Darius felt overwhelmed by his sudden public profile. After all, he'd never sought fame or notoriety. Yet, he found purpose in using his platform to effect positive change. He often recalled those anxious moments on the plane, watching Jacqueline skip over him for service, or threatening to call security. He remembered how powerless he felt. Now, he stood as living proof that standing up for oneself could topple even the mightiest of institutions. In the end, Cloud9 Airlines was a cautionary tale, an empire that crumbled under the weight of its own misdeeds. Perhaps, in some cosmic sense, it was karmic justice, hard and unyielding. For Darius, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his dignity was not just reclaimed, but elevated. He had shown the world what could happen when a single individual refused to accept injustice, and he hoped that his story would remind others that they too had the power to fight back. And there you have it, the unbelievable yet eye-opening account of how one man's courage toppled a corporate giant. Darius Johnson's determination to stand tall against discrimination turned his personal nightmare into a watershed moment for airline accountability. Never forget, one voice, bolstered by evidence, truth, and unwavering resolve, can move mountains or, in this case, bring down an entire airline. If you found yourself cheering Darius on, if you felt that rush of satisfaction when justice was finally served, then do us a favor. Hit that like button, share this story with a friend who needs a reminder that real change is possible, and subscribe for more stories that prove grit and persistence can alter destinies. Let's keep the conversation going and help ensure that no passenger, no person has to endure what Darius did ever again.